Hello and welcome to the first in a series of Masterclass videos for MidiStep. This is the first in a series of videos for the absolute beginner. So if you've just bought MidiStep, this is where you want to start. And we're going to look at the interface and we're going to look at some of the basic features in this video. Now when you run MidiStep for the first time, the interface can look quite daunting because there's a lot of buttons and knobs around the place. But when you focus, you'll find that it's actually not so complicated as you might think. And I also want to point out that all my apps have a user manual available there on the main menu. This is an extremely well written manual written by David Collett. So if you're stuck on anything, the first port of call would be the help manual. And as you can see, everything is color coded, so it's easy to find your way around. Now if you want, you can export the manual to PDF and take a leisurely read through it without actually having the restrictions of running it inside the program. Now as many of you know, I've standardized the way buttons work. So if we look at the top left corner of some buttons, you'll see a little chevron, a little triangle in the top left corner. And this is indicative of the fact there's a long press feature assigned to that button. And a little downward arrow means there's a swipe feature attached to that button. And we'll see these two symbols throughout the interface. Now there are 4 sections to this interface, and at the very top we have the master pattern length. And that can be adjusted by the master pattern length knob. Below the master pattern bar there is the notes pane and its associated controls. Below the notes pane is the octave pane, and notice also the controls for the octave are very similar to the controls for the notes lane. And finally we have the parameter and modulation lane and its associated controls. Now other than those 4 main areas, we also have an area for defining patterns, which allows us to chain different sequences together. And tucked away down in the bottom right is the step options, which are options which are applicable to the selected column. Now changing the master pattern length changes all the other lanes to be the same length. So if I set the master pattern length to 8, the octave lane and the param lane have also been changed to 8. Now usually you want the master length longer than the individual note lengths or the octave lengths. As you can see here, we can control these independently using the respective length knob to the right of that lane. Now the reason this bottom pane is called a parameter pane is because it can show all sorts of things like velocity, gate, divider, repeat and delay. And this is also where we can access a further 8 lanes of modulation. So let's take a look at an example. And I'm going to run this in AUM, which plenty of you are familiar with. You can see here I have an instance of MidiStep loaded, and it's important to note that it's loaded as a MIDI plugin, not an audio plugin. Now when I start the AUM transport, you can see that MidiStep is activated and sending MIDI, but we've not picked anywhere to send that MIDI to. Now you can see here I've got a copy of SynthMaster 2, and all I need to do is plumb that in to MidiStep's MIDI output. And now if we press play on the transport, we'll hear a sound emitting from SynthMaster. So let's start playing with these note faders. And let's put that first note up an octave. Now what I want you to notice here is the little flashing cursor that's flying across the master pattern length. And every time it reaches the end of that pattern, it's resetting the notes lane. And that's because this rewind button is turned on. But if we turn it off, you won't get such a recognizable repeated pattern. It'll just meander on because the lane lengths are different for both the pattern the notes and the octave lane. So let's re-enable that again. Now, I mentioned earlier that the param lane can edit 8 lanes of modulation, so let's go try that. Simply click on modulation here and you'll see that this param bar now shows the 8 lanes of modulation. So let's double tap down here on the CC number and pick modulation CC1. Now we need to enable this in order for anything to be sent, and then we just draw in our curve. Now these faders, you can just click in one fader and then swipe across them, which it becomes very useful and allows you to quickly draw modulation curves or ramps. Now if you're one of them people that don't like the pop-ups that appear when you start dragging the faders, you can turn them off in settings. Now when it comes to using MidiStep, one of the first things you're going to want to do is set up the key and scale so that everything sounds right. Now by default the scale is set to chromatic, so in other words it's using all 12 notes of an octave. Now first I want to point out there's just an infinite number of scales here, but I'm going to pick a major scale. Now the key is currently set to C, I'm going to change it to D, so we're in D major, and I just want to point out the octave is octave 3. So now if we take a look at this first slider and start manipulating it, you'll see as I drag it up and down, you'll see a little pop-up telling us the note and the MIDI number of that particular slider. In this case, when it's all the way at the bottom, we're playing D3. Now if for some reason you don't like a note that's been played, or you want to assign your own scale, just long press on the scale button and you can customize this scale by tapping on these notes and adding or removing notes, and as you can see they adjust how many notes are on display. So this is very useful for tweaking existing scales, but I recommend you do all your tweaking before you start working. So let's start by taking an in-depth look at the randomization features within MidiStep. In particular I want to talk about lane randomization. Now at the top right of the interface is a little dice button, and if we press that it does a global randomize, and we'll talk about that later. But let's init the patch and take a look at the lane randomize, which is this little button here. Now every single lane has its own dice button which allows you to randomize per lane. Now I want you to notice the fact that when I'm randomizing these octave values, we're never getting a value of -2 no matter how many times I press it. Now if you long press this dice button, you'll get a little pop-up which allows you to configure the randomization. So essentially this is telling us that there's a 50% probability that we're going to randomize an octave between -1 and 2, and anything that does not fall, the other 50%, are going to be set to the default, which is 0. So to demonstrate this in action, I'm going to set the probability down to 0, and then I'm going to go out and randomize some values, and you'll see that, well, there's a 0 probability, so they're all going to end up as default. If I set it to 100%, you'll see that everything is being randomized. If I set it to 25% and set the lower octave down to -2, you'll see that 25% of the randomized values are something other than 0. Now if we up that default value to 1, you'll see that the default value, the majority of them in other words, are set to 1, and those that pass the probability will be set to something else. Now when it comes to randomizing notes, there's a 50% chance that the value picked is going to be a random value, and there's a 50% chance that it will be the default value, which is the root note. Now we can restrict the range of notes if we wish. which is very useful. Sometimes it's nice to get things that are floating around that root note. And finally, if we randomize the velocity lane, you'll see that there's very little variation in velocities. It's kind of simulating a humanized feel, but we're free to extend that range if we wish. So that covers the local randomization, but what about global randomization? The global randomization simply means we can randomize more than one pane at a time. And just like with the local lane randomization buttons, we can also long press this button to get at the global options. Now, while this might look a little bit daunting, this dialog, it's actually all split into different categories. Right now we're looking at the sequencer options, but we can also toggle this to show the modulation. And like I said before, we have 8 lanes of modulation, so we can click through these various tabs to see those. Now if we click back on the sequencer lane, you'll see there's a number of tabs there that mimic what we can see on the parameter lane. Now I want to point out this little asterisk that you can see beside each of the tabs, and they signify that randomization is enabled for that particular parameter. Now the first 4 knobs, the probability, minimum, maximum and default knobs, just mimic what we saw before in the little pop-up randomization dialogues for each lane. So they're duplicated inside here, so you really know what they are. Just a reminder, if we look in here, they're the 4 items that we see in the global dialog, and they're available on every tab. So beneath those 4 knobs are 3 others that are all to do with probability. So I can set like a 55% chance that a probability will be set per step, and that probability will be somewhere between the minimum and maximum values I set with the other 2 knobs. Now we haven't talked about probability yet, but we're going to in a little while. And also some of the other knobs in here are to do with things we've not discussed yet, but they'll become obvious later on in this video. Now if we switch to the velocity tab and turn off randomization for this option, you'll see the little asterisk in the tab disappears. So as I mentioned before, it's a great way to determine what is enabled and what is not. Now if I long click on this enable randomization button, you'll see that it applies that setting to all tabs. So if I turn this off and then long press it, all of them will be turned off and the asterisks disappear on all the tabs. Now this is great if you want to turn everything off and then just turn on whatever it is you want to randomize. So now if I switch to the Octave tab, I can enable that, and we're only going to get notes and octaves randomized. Now since we're looking at the notes tab, if I press the randomize selected button, it will randomize things for the selected tab, which in this case is the notes lane. But don't fall into this trap. If I select the velocity lane and hit the randomize selected, nothing is randomized because it's not turned on. You've got to enable the randomization before it will work by clicking this checkbox. Now as you can see, every time I press the randomize button, a different length of lane is generated. Now we can disable this by just clicking the appropriate checkbox, and then every time I click the randomize, it maintains that. Now we can manually adjust and ensure that that's never re-randomized. So if I press the randomize all now, we get in all the selected items, note, octaves and velocity randomized. Now each tab has this random jump and random rewind, and these are associated with the 2 buttons that appear to the right of each lane. So the random jump and the random rewind we've not actually discussed yet, but we will do in a little while. Now returning to the notes tab, there are 3 knobs at the top right that we haven't discussed, and notice they're all step options: step random, step disable and step note skip. And normally you adjust these in this little step options panel to the bottom right of the display. And the final 2 options are to do with generating chords, but we've not looked at that yet and we probably won't get to it in this video, but needless to say that's what they're for. So there was a lot of talk about step options in that last section, so let's take a look at what they are and how to use them. So a step option is simply a parameter that is changeable at every single vertical column of this sequence. Now the first and obvious step option is the little button which is above each column of the notes pane. Currently they're all set to on. And we're going to try playing with those. We'll play back a sequence and turn a few on and off and give you an idea of how they affect what's playing. So that's really broken up the monotony of the 1/8 beat. But since there's a chevron in the top left corner of all these buttons, we can long press and pick other options, and in this case I'm going to pick tie, and this actually ties two columns together to extend the note length. Now another option that's available to us when we long press is randomize. So I'm going to set that fourth column to random. Now if I let that play, you'll realise that even though we've got that column set to random, we're not getting a random note. And that's simply because the probability on that randomised pane was set to 0. So I'm going to set that to 100%. So as you can see, the randomization values in this dialog affect what notes are actually randomized per column. Now in this next example, I want you to notice the step options in the bottom right corner. Now if you don't see those, it's probably because you're on the modulation tab. If we're on the modulation tab, we get to see stuff regarding the modulation. So flick back to the sequencer tab. Now the two options I'm going to be covering in this example are the probability and the note skip. Now I want you to take a listen to this example, and then we'll attempt to put note skip on one of the columns. Now it's important to note that when I tap in various columns in this pattern length bar, whatever position I click on is reflected down in this bottom right corner here. So let's set the note skip to 2 for column 3. Now I hope you heard that. On the second pass of the cursor, that note was dropped. So if we set the note skip to 2, it's dropped every other step, and if we set it to 3, it will be dropped every 3 steps, and so on. Now let's take a look at the probability, and it works in exactly the same way as a note step. So I'm going to start the sequencer, pick an appropriate note, and then set its probability to something like 60%. Now for those of you that are not familiar with the term probability, this is just a percentage that represents the likelihood of a note playing. Now the last two knobs in the step options are all to do with chord generation, and we're not going to cover that in this video. So the next thing I want to show you is how to use the random jump button and what it does. Now the random jump button is to the right of every lane, and you can turn that on and off as you wish. So listen carefully to this pattern. even though all the lanes are set to different lengths, you can still pick out a rhythm there and where the rhythm repeats. But let's turn on the note jump and see what happens. So as you can see, with note jump turned on, the cursor no longer travels from left to right, it just randomly jumps from column to column. So this is a great option to turn on and put some unpredictability into the sequence. Now, we've previously mentioned the parameter lane, but I want to go over each of the parameters in turn and show you how they work. Starting with the velocity lane. Now, I think we all know that velocity is the loudness of the note, but I'm going to show you a little tip here. If you position one of these faders and double tap it, it will set all the faders to that value. So that one was quite predictable. You can draw velocity ramps in here. And that double tap little tip is very useful and one to remember. So let's take a look at the gate parameter. So right now all the note lengths are the same for each column, so let's try a randomizing variance of this. So that made quite a difference to the dynamics of that pattern, and you could always turn on random jump to make it even more dramatic if you wish. So now let's move on to the divider. Now the divider allows us to split a note into multiple notes, so it can play 2, 3 or even 4 notes per step. So let's try splitting some of these notes up into 2. So if we turn on the random jump, we get a 3 in 16 chance of a double note. So the next column along is the repeat option, and it's a little bit more complicated to explain than the other tabs, so bear with me. So a repeat note is something that is played multiple times, and that depends on where the fader is for that column. And it allows us to repeat a note 1, 2, 3, up to 7 times. So let's set that first note to repeat 4 times. Now, although that's useful, it's even better if we tell it to play an ascending or descending scale. Now for fun, let's turn on the random jump. So there's lots of fun to be had by using the repeat function. And the last one is the delay, which, as you've probably guessed, delays a note, and it's very similar to swing. So that concludes the rundown of the parameter lane, and also concludes this beginner's guide tutorial. But don't worry, there'll be more masterclass videos to come. Now don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and if you like these videos, don't forget to thumb up this video. I'll see you next time.